Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, good evening. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's great to have everyone here for the launch of Preserving the Legacy, Creating the National World War II Museum. Now, as we continue to celebrate our museum's 25th anniversary, we thought there's no better way to officially kick off our public commemoration than to look back on our collective history and how this institution came to be. But of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment to remember that 81 years ago, right now, millions of men and women of the Allied Expeditionary Forces were preparing for the D-Day, the landings in Normandy, including members of the 82nd Airborne Pathfinders who loaded up and jumped from the C-47 right above us. So just keep those in your thoughts. As we celebrate tonight the book and the museum and Dr. Mueller and Dr. Ambrose, we can remember the great anticipation and the strain weighing on millions as they set about to liberate the oppressed peoples. Now, before we get too far tonight, I'd like to recognize a few special guests with us tonight. We have two World War II veterans, Victor Cheney in the 5th ID, an infantry soldier, and Jim Deal, an armor crewman in Patton's 3rd Army. Jim and Victor, glad you're here with us tonight. And then I know we have a few others on campus today. Do we have any other World War II veterans, homefront workers, or Holocaust survivors in attendance this evening? Well, for those watching online, let's give them a round of applause as well. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize any veterans or active duty members of our nation's armed forces who may be in attendance this evening. Would you either wave or stand and be recognized as well? And of course, their service is only possible with the support of their family members. So any family members of service members or active duty members in the room tonight, would you also stand or wave and be recognized? Thank you for what you've done. Thank you all for your service, your sacrifice. It has made a difference. I'd also like to recognize a few other important individuals and groups with us this evening. We have Suzanne Medier, our chair of our Board of Trustees, and her husband, Mike. We also have our past chair of our Board of Trustees, Governor Pete Wilson, and his wife, Gail. Governor. Also noticed a few other members of our Board of Trustees, past and present, Robert Priddy, Mike Byland, Glenn Solomon, Will Osborne, Jimmy Reese. Let's give them a round of applause as well. We also have the convener of our museum's presidential counselors, Dr. Alan Millett, the Stephen E. Ambrose Professor of History and the Director of Eisenhower Center, University of New Orleans. And I haven't seen him yet, but I understand he's here. Dr. Gunter Bischoff is also a longtime presidential counselor. Gunter? So he was one of the students of Drs. Mueller and Ambrose back in the day, so now Professor Emeritus and former Director of Center Austria. We also have many Patriot Circle and charter members here, as well as supporters of our capital projects and educational programs who do so much to help us achieve our mission. Thank you for your support as well. Let's give them a round of applause. We're honored this evening as well with countless volunteers from the museum, Higgins boat workers, former staff, many of which predate me by decades, I should say. Thank you for your service and dedication to this amazing place. Thank you all. I'd also like to give a shout out. We have more than 30 graduates of our Masters in World War II Studies program in partnership with Arizona State University. They're joined by over 50 friends and family for this 25th anniversary. I know this was a huge idea. They've graduated with their master's degree. We've got our faculty partners and Dr. Jeffrey Cohen, the Dean of Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at ASU. Welcome, welcome to you all. Honoring us as well this evening of the family of Mueller and Dr. Stephen Ambrose, whose vision, as you'll hear about tonight from Nick, made all this possible. Ambrose family. And of course, up front, the Mueller family and Nick's wife Beth and their sons David and John. Thanks for all that your families have contributed and sacrificed to this idea that has become a reality. So thank you very much. And it's my pleasure as well to welcome new friends to the museum, to our family. Welcome all the old friends, many of you that certainly predate me, but thank you for honoring this event, but Nick this evening. And thanks, of course, to all of you watching on the live stream. Now on to tonight's program. Our featured speaker is well known to most, if not all of us here tonight. Dr. Gordon H. Nick Mueller is the former board chairman, founding president and CEO Emeritus of the National WWII Museum. Nick studied at the University of Vienna, and he earned his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You'll notice Jim has a Chapel Hill shirt on, Nick. He had a 32-year career at the University of New Orleans as a professor of European history, and then dean and vice chancellor at UNO, where he played a leading role in creating the Metro College, Center Austria, and the International Summer School in Innsbruck, Austria. If that's not enough, Nick was also president of the UNO Research and Technology Park, much of this while he was creating the museum with his best friend, Stephen Ambrose. Now, interviewing Nick tonight will be noted author, historian, and editor Steve Vogel. Thanks for coming tonight, Steve. Steve is a veteran journalist who's written extensively for the Washington Post about military affairs, the treatment of veterans from the wars post-Afghanistan and Iraq. Steve covered the September 11th terrorist attack on the Pentagon, the building's subsequent reconstruction. He's covered conflicts around the world from the Middle East to Africa and the Balkans. Steve is the author of Through the Perilous Fight, a book about the burning of Washington, D.C. I should note I have the image from the cover on the wall in my office. That's a long story. But he's also authored The Pentagon, A History. Now, Steve served as the editor of Preserving the Legacy with Nick, and there's really no better person to converse with Nick this evening. Now, before these gentlemen come to the stage, it is my pleasure, though, first to call the President and CEO of the National WWII Museum to the podium, Stephen Watson. Stephen?
Okay, well, thank you, Mike, and good evening, everyone. It's great to see a full house for such a special night. So in the next hour and a half, I'm going to talk about Nick. Since for 17 years, he would always get up and say everything I was meant to say after him. This is payback tonight, Nick. No, I'm just joking. So when we were putting this program together, I said, Mike, you do all the heavy lifting, and I just want to have a moment of president's privilege to say a few words before we get into the discussion with Nick and Steve. And of course, they're going to talk tonight about the journey to build our magnificent museum. And as I think many of you here tonight know, and you will hear in this discussion, it's an incredible story and has all the drama you would expect from such an ambitious and significant endeavor. And as I have said many times before, and it can't be said enough, I think it was Nick's leadership and ability to bring people and resources together that made all of this possible. And there were a lot of ups and downs on that journey. Now, this past week, we honored Nick with our American Spirit Award, and during Nick's acceptance speech, he talked about that we were all in this Higgins boat together on this journey to build this museum. And Nick, I think we all knew we were privileged to be along with you on this journey in that Higgins boat. So I'm not going to talk about building the museum. I'm going to leave that to Nick and Steve to discuss, and of course, you absolutely should buy the book to get the full picture of that. But what I did think I would like to reflect on is the foundation that Nick provided all of us, the people, I think, responsible for carrying on this important mission. I think it's paramount to acknowledge this because Nick's legacy and accomplishments at the museum, I think, are more than the buildings, more than the exhibits and the programs and the collections. I think Nick instilled a culture and laid a foundation that demands excellence. You see it all around you, and one that never takes the easy route. A foundation that's built on yes, not no, that challenges the boundaries of what a museum can be. A foundation built on bringing people together. You're all here tonight. Historians, board members, donors, volunteers, staff, partners. And you all knew when you got in that Higgins boat with Nick, he was going to demand a full measure of your commitment. A foundation that honors the significance and the importance of the mission. I think Nick was always clear, this is not an exercise in nostalgia. This is an important and noble mission that we serve. This is an important mission that will endure for generations to come, and I think all of us have a significant role in helping shape the legacy of the war and those that served. So for me, these are the ingredients, the secret or maybe not so secret recipe that drove our success over the last 25 years. And I think that is the real gift that you have left to all of us, Nick, as we carry this mission forward. So thank you. So tomorrow will be another big day at the National World War II Museum, and we will announce a new strategic vision for the next phase of the museum's development. And we'll also announce the price tag that comes along with that next phase of the museum's development, because no money, there's no mission. But Nick, in closing, we are grateful for instilling in all of us the culture and the confidence to keep pushing, to reach high, believe that our best days are yet to come, knowing that our museum and mission has never been more important. So for that, thank you.
Mic'd up here? It's time. Let me, I gotta get this. So I'll fumble around later. There you go. All right, I think we're ready. Well, before we get started, just a couple of words of thank you, extended thank you. First, to my editorial team, starting with Steve Vogel, Marissa Prebo, and Taylor Doherty, and Jason Van. Where are you guys? If you guys would stand up here, this is the team that helped get us here. And tremendous group, and they had to help me through thick and thin while the Liberation Pavilion was going up and the hotel and everything else. So it was 4 years, started during COVID, get here, and I want to thank you. And again, my wife and family, and Manning and Dalton, my grandkids, and Dave and Emily and John, and all the Muellers down here, Christina, Mary Beth, and the Ambroses clan. It couldn't be any better than to have you all here. The trustees, of course, Pete and Gail, and so much a part of this story, and the others that have been mentioned. Alyssa Plant, president of LSU Press, also a key member of the team, and thank you for just a great work that you performed for getting this book out. And so handsome, and gotten some very positive comments so far. So in any event, and to all the former board members that are here, and volunteers, veterans, of course, sitting here, the true heroes, and what really inspired Steve Ambrose to get us started. I wonder, are there, just by a show of hands, any students of Steve Ambrose out here? Raise your hands. So, all right, it's a good group. All right. And how many people are members? Raise your hand. Well, it's not 100% yet. We got some work to do. How many people were here 25 years? I'm going to take something from Stephen. How many people were here 25 years ago? That's a good number. How many people were here 30 years ago? On the front row, yeah. Okay, in any event, let me just say before we get going that Preserving the Legacy, of course, is the title of this book. The placeholder for a long time was Unlikely Story. Who the hell, I mean, two historians doing a museum like this, so, but that was just a placeholder. So, but I just want to say first, before we get going here, that there are 3 or 4 stories embedded in this, which made it very difficult to write, because it's, first of all, why it happened, secondly, how it happened, thirdly, what happened in terms of what's the content and the mission of this museum, and how do we do that. So those are 3 big stories, and then the 4th story, of course, is my own personal overlay, my memoir, I guess, if you will, and because all of this 35 years, going back to the beginning, were my own journey through the entire process. So I'll turn it over to my editor, who has been guiding me along, and I've told him, I said, make this story better by cutting about 30% of it every time I sent him something, and he did.
It was more like 40%.
How much? 40%? That was even better. But the rest of it, the outtakes are in the museum archives, and they're still going to be useful to somebody. So, in any event, so you're on.
Well, Nick, one of the first things that struck me about the draft you were putting together was that this whole story seemed to start with, like many things in New Orleans, with an afternoon or evening of drinking. So can you relate that part of the tale?
It did indeed, and the Ambrose clan and the Mueller clan were witness to a lot of those 5 o'clock sherry parties, and this one was special. Steve and I cooked up a lot of our ideas of things we do together, and this day it was a little bit different, and Steve had a look about him as he shoved me over a glass of cheap Gallo sherry, and said, sit down. Said, I got an idea. And so this was the idea, the D-Day, a small D-Day museum. I'm going to give you all my oral histories, about 600, 700. Andrew Higgins never been recognized. Congress is never going to do a damn thing up there. I've talked to him, blue in the face, and somebody's got to recognize what was accomplished on D-Day, and that's where I'm going to start. So I'll give you everything, and you got free land in that research park, and that's where Higgins tested the landing craft, and we're going to honor Andrew Higgins too. So I said, Steve, that's the best idea you ever had. And he said, good. He says, I said, I'm in. He said, oh, great. He says, it's only going to be $1 million. Ah, come on, Steve. I said, you know, you're naive about these things. It's going to be at least $4 million. Oh, God. He says, we could never raise that kind of money. I said, well, it's a small project here, so, but it's going to cost $4 million. And of course, as I said yesterday, you know, a lot of people come have dreams and visions, but visions without money don't go anywhere. They're called hallucinations. And so Steve promptly went up to Washington and asked Bob Livingston, our chair of appropriations at that time, and told him the same story that Steve told me. And I said, he said, Bob said the same thing. What do you need? And he says, $4 million. And he said, you got it. And that got us started. And I said to Steve, where'd you get that number? He says, from you. I said, I didn't expect him to ask me how much we needed. Anyway, that's where it started. And I missed a few zeros.
Yeah. So you had that land, the research park that you and UNO had, and it was free, and you two thought this was the perfect spot. This was a historic spot too, because this was where Higgins had done a lot of the testing for the Higgins boats on Lake Pontchartrain. And you soon learned a reality that there were some problems with that site, even though I guess it took you two a little while to go along with that.
Well, it did. And Gunter Bischoff, I see over there, and he knew about all those stories because he was assistant to Stephen Ambrose in the Eisenhower Center then, associate director. And almost immediately from the first day, we created a nonprofit board of directors to launch this thing. Once we had $4 million, the advisory group all said, well, let's form an independent nonprofit. And we did, and did a lot of that work to get it going. And from the very first day, Lee Schlesinger, who was the chairman, he had issues about the location on the research park site and so far from downtown. And, you know, this controversy went on. It divided the board very badly over the next 3-4 years. And it was free land, but they didn't have any alternative to downtown. There was not enough money to buy a building. We had the $4 million could only be used for capital projects. We had no staff. Steve was the fundraiser in chief. We were selling the story as much as we could. But you know, what were we crazy is what one of the chairman said, you know, we had no demand studies, we had no feasibility studies, we had no staff, we were not good at raising money after the $4 million. And we had free land. That was all we had on a historic site. And that's what kept us going despite the controversy. And people wanted downtown. And we brought in a consultant. We could use the federal money for consultants. And we had a woman from Baltimore who was really hired and contracted by Lee Schlesinger and Boyce Mansfield. And she came and did a feasibility study, interviewed everybody, and gave a report, I think it was around 1992 or 3, and said, you've all got to decide whether you're going to be a research center, which the Eisenhower Center was, and had this 700 oral histories and ongoing projects that happen to have a museum, or you're going to, and then the research park is a perfect location. You get grants for research and everything else. And he said, or are you going to be a museum that happens to have a research center, meaning Steve's Eisenhower Center? And I listened to that presentation. I said, it's going downtown. It's going downtown because everybody knows that we're going to have to support this thing once we open it, and we weren't going to get visitors out there to the extent that we could downtown. And then that's where we ended up.
Right. Well, I guess in November 1995, you had the board meeting where John Kushner kind of put out a bit of a surprise that more or less settled the issue right away. What was that?
Yeah, there was part of the board that was going rogue, looking for sites down here. And John Kushner was this brilliant commercial realtor who was on our board, and he, behind the scenes, was looking for a place for us downtown because there was no other alternative. And we, by the way, didn't have enough money to build. The latest price for the architecture for the research park was about somewhere between 15 and 25 million or 30 million. Nobody really knew, but we had a sketch of it and exhibits designed. So all of a sudden, here we have $1 million left of that $4 million. And we found out that in 18 months, it was going back to Washington if we didn't do something with it. And so John found a building, this building we're sitting in back there, not this building, this wasn't here. There was a loading dock back there for this freight forwarding warehouse. It used to be a brewery in the 19th century, and there was this, where we're sitting right here, that was an empty lot, and probably a picture of it up here somewhere. But we thought that was great, and conversation, debate over, we were going downtown. And the Eisenhower Center moved to the building next door. So that was how we ended up down here. The state debate was over in an instant, but it was a big controversy and divided the board a lot.
Mm-hmm. You were then faced, I guess, with quite a few funding problems, and you had to figure out the next steps. And it looked like in 1998 that you were suddenly faced with a fork in the road that you weren't really expecting.
Well, yeah, and look, once I moved out of the research park in '95 downtown, I was still on the board, so was Steve and the chancellor. But there was a rough patch or two. We went broke 2 or 3 times, and Steve always got angry because he had to write checks for the only administrative assistant we had out of his checkbook because they squandered the money in something he thought was the wrong way to spend the money. And I was on sabbatical going back to teaching, and after 20 years in administration, and so I just totally ambushed, and knowing in the last few years we had gone broke a couple times, and just as recently as a couple of months ago, before that, and I came to a meeting of the executive committee, and suddenly back on the executive committee, and then Steve Ambrose was out there smoking with Greg O'Brien and General Livingston, the 3 of them on a very cold day. It's all in the book, this is an amazing story. So I'm trying to run in and get into the warm, and it was cold, it was like 20, 32 degrees, and the wind was blowing. And they grabbed me and they said, well, we want you to be the next chairman. I said, what? Huh? I said, and I looked at Steve and he says, you got me into this. You got to get me out. The chancellor was there saying, I'm going to donate your time for the next 2 years. You only have to teach 1 course. And, but it was a 50-50 call for me for 4 or 5 months. And I was digging into the books a little bit and trying to make a decision. And then when I flew up to Montana to spend a few weeks with Steve in the end of May, and here comes this letter from General Livingston, Medal of Honor recipient, the previous chair, or the chair at that time. And he says, look, I'm stepping down this summer. And I was copied on this, but since I wasn't home, I didn't got it. So Steve and I read it together, and it says, we're broke again, we're running out of money, and we got $170,000, and we got contractors working, and we're going to be out of money in May. So tell Nick he's got to make a decision. So came back, and a couple of weeks later, I just said, okay. Steve said, do whatever you want. We got some other plans if you don't do that, and rest is history.
I guess part of the issue was that there was no one else who was going to take the job either, right?
Well, that was the other funny thing. I was wondering to myself for those 5 months, how come all these big shot board members and business leaders, why weren't they stepping up? Well, they knew the same thing I did. So I was the only guy that was left in the barrel there that would take on the job. And things were pretty casual, board meetings and so forth. I mean, Boise Bollinger told me he didn't even know how he got elected vice chairman. And he wasn't at the meeting when he was elected. So that was a Wild West days of our board, and you'll pick up on some of that in the book, I think. So at any event, so the rest is history, and we had 2 years to get it done, and General Livingston gave me the farewell and said, Nick, he says, good luck. He said, I got everything done for you. There's only $1 million left to raise. And, Now, I knew enough to know that was not true. We didn't have any funding for this building. We were going to have an entry level in this loading dock where they're going to stick the Higgins boat and a Jeep in the loading dock. And that was going to be the entrance of the old warehouse. And we had no offices for any staff. We didn't have a store. We didn't have anything but the D-Day exhibits paid for and our Academy Award nominated film in the Forbes Theater on the ground floor. And I said, well, Jim, I said, how are we going to pay for all those things? He said, well, good luck. But you'll do it. He says, it's only $1 million more, but it turned out to be about 20. So, and we'd only raised up until that time. Now, public money was always, I had to learn this. Public money came first, the $4 million, and then the state came up with $2.5 million and said, once you buy something that you can finish, like this warehouse, then finally in '97 they started paying for the renovations. The state really wants you to finish a building. The federal government doesn't care. So we had $4 million, we had $1 million, we bought this. They didn't care if we finished it. We had a building, it was going to be the D-Day building. But in any event, Governor Foster and others came through, but we raised about $400,000 a year for 6 years, and we had to raise what turned out to be a little over $10 million more in 2 years.
And the Times-Picayune had I guess a fairly encouraging review of the situation in '98, where they said that the museum was foundering like a Higgins boat strafed by Nazi gunners.
That's right. That was what their estimate. James Varney wrote that article in Times-Picayune. He says that's since 1994, which was kind of our high point. We had a film. We had a big USO thing in the Roosevelt Hotel. Steve was interviewed by President Clinton before the D-Day, the 50th anniversary, with Tom Brokaw over there, and we all had 500 people in Normandy, and that was the high point. And then we kind of went into this big valley until '98. And that's what Varney wrote that article. But he said prospects are looking brighter at the end of that. So
I guess then you're shooting to get open by June 6th, 2000.
Yeah.
And there seemed to be some skepticism. Frank Stewart comes here. He's
Yeah.
one of your major donors.
Well, yeah, Frank Stewart, I wish he were here. He got us over the hump. I mean, Governor Foster funded this, and Hunt Downer and the Louisiana legislature, they were just fantastic. In the fall of '98, the first thing I did is said, we got to have an entrance pavilion besides that loading dock. And so Governor Foster and the Senate and the House, God bless them, they gave a commitment to get us almost $4 million to build this setting here. But it was going to be tight because the money couldn't come out until the summer of '99. And by spring, in May, we had contractors working all over here. There must have been 60, 70 people welding up in here. And Frank Stewart had just donated $2 million in May of '99. So flash forward 12 months to April, May, before we open. And I'm standing back here, back by the entrance, and we're putting the roof on, redoing the whole thing. There was a big gash. It was a huge downpour. It looked like Niagara Falls coming in behind me. I had my biggest donor standing there telling me with hard hat on, Nick, he says, you're not going to make it. He said, believe me, I've built funeral homes all over the world. He says, you can't be ready in 6 months. He says, what's your backup plan? I said, I'm told by my contractors, and I believe them, that we're going to be done. And he says, but you're not going to be done. And now I'm trying to be very polite to a $2 million donor. And he says, come on, he says, this is not going to happen. Look at this. You got people, roof is not even close. And he says, so what's your backup plan? Finally, I just said, South America. Well, he politely moved on at that point. But we were literally, as every building, as Stephen knows, that we've opened, it's been right down to the wire, up to the end. And we were, sweeping the floors and mopping staff, everybody till midnight that night, but we got open.
You had some pretty remarkable contractors, the Goutis.
Yeah, the Gouti family, Elaine and her sister, and they were both, they got the contract to build this pavilion, and their father was a World War II veteran. And when they wrote the letter for application, and in the presentation, because it had to be bid out because it was state money, and they were the low bid by a good bit, and they said, our dad will never forgive us if we don't get this building finished. And that whole family and that firm worked day and night. They built this building in 9 months because the funding and the bidding process got delayed. They didn't start till September, and this whole thing was built in time for opening. And it was that World War II spirit, that can-do spirit. They were afraid of their dad, but they were committed, and it was a great story to have the children of a veteran building this building. So
what was it like 25 years ago today, basically? You had pretty high expectations for the opening, and what did you see?
Well, this evening was on the 5th, we had a big event here with the Secretary of Defense, Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and Tom Brokaw, and a lot of World War II veterans, including Hal Baumgarten, who we're going to celebrate tomorrow. I mean, Hal was there, and Secretary Cohen gave Stephen a Freedom Medal, and then we went all over to the Roosevelt. We were late, and we get to the Roosevelt. We had this all reserved. Sponsors bought tables, but all the veterans got in there first, and they commandeered about 10 of the paid-for sponsored tables. And they said, "We took Iwo Jima. You're not going to move us out of here." And so I had a lot of angry donors came up and said, "You got to get them. I paid for this." And I said, "You go get them." I'm not going to get those guys out of there. And so anyhow, it was a great night, and it went on till 1 in the morning. And Tom Brokaw concluded, he said, "We went from the longest day to the longest dinner." And Hal Baumgarten was the featured speaker, and he was riveting. And Tom Brokaw says to Hanks and Spielberg, "I'm not following that guy." He said, he's got the big bars here. What he did, we've done nothing. And so it was a moment. And this day here, 200,000 people on the streets and parades, and I imagine a lot of people were here on that day of June 6th, and it was just fantastic. I think the city and those who participated, and it was just 20 feet deep all the way around down Poitras down to the convention center. And General Maz, who was in charge for Secretary of Defense, told me recently that it was 200,000. But I asked him, he didn't give me that number at the time. I said, it's all packed here. What's it like everywhere else? He says, "It's packed like this everywhere." But he said Secretary of Defense told him he wanted to have the greatest military parade that the veterans missed when they came home. And we had 80 trucks and about 20 in each, and everybody on the parade route was saying thank you or crying. It was photographs. It was amazing.
I guess it's easy to forget today that this was just the D-Day, National D-Day Museum
Yeah.
we're opening. You look at the headline, it's really cool. 25 years ago, Times-Picayune headline, it's the D-Day Museum opens. You had just days before that received quite a shock when you met with Senator Stevens. What happened then?
Yeah, you'll read about all these little anecdotes and stories as you read the book, and please buy the book. So Senator Stevens couldn't be here because he had an appointment in Alaska, and he was a great fan of Stephen, and he was the senator who was a head of appropriations at the time, and defense appropriations. And he was a Pacific War historian from the China-Burma India Theater and Distinguished Flying Cross. And so he told me and Stephen, after a tour of the exhibits, private tour that we did 3 days before opening, we got up the fourth floor at the end of it. He said, you guys come into your office, and he shooed his staff away. I said, uh-oh, so staff can't even hear what he's going to say. So he comes in there and he says, well, you guys have built the best, this D-Day, it's the best museum on World War II in the country, but he says, you don't have my war, you don't have the Pacific, you don't have Danny Inouye's war in the Mediterranean. You got to do the whole thing. And just the three of us there, and he says, you got to talk to your board, you got to find land to expand on, but look, if you guys agree to do it and your board agrees to expand to do all of World War II, he said, I'll help. Well, coming from that man who was the king of pork in the Senate, but had already helped us with a couple of billion. And Steve rolled his eyes over us, kind of like, Nick, don't say yes, don't say yes. We're done, we're done. But of course, I felt if I'd said yes, no, that Senator Stevens would have walked out and said, it's okay, boys, you done a great thing. But we said yes, and then a couple days later, Boise was talking to Senator Breaux right here looking out the window at the parade, and Senator Breaux says, you got to buy all that land over there. Well, Senator Stevens bought it all. So, I mean, I just want to say Senator Stevens and Danny Inouye, but Senator Stevens at that time, because the Republicans were in majority, and he got us $4 million a year for 3 years, and we bought all the land we needed and did the master planning and created a national board. So without Senator Stevens, full stop, there wouldn't be any World War II museum, because we had no money anymore. We had spent every dime we had to get this thing open. And before that, it was University of New Orleans for 10 years. They were the incubator for this museum when we had no staff. And there was a great story in Clancy Dubose in the paper today, singing the praises of all the people at UNO and the foundation and accounting and physical plant. So UNO, Steve, of course, was the glue that held it all together, Steve Ambrose. But UNO was the incubator, and then Senator Stevens launched us into the future. So that's what happened.
It wasn't really too long after that you lost Steve.
Yeah.
And could you talk about that a little bit and tell us how you and the board were able to move forward after that loss?
I can't talk about it too much without getting pretty emotional. You know, we went a couple more years, and in May of 2002, after he'd been in the Pacific for a month with Maura and his son, Hugh, and we were getting design work starting, and he wanted to be on Guadalcanal and Tarawa and the islands of the Pacific. He'd never written anything, so Steve wanted boots on the ground. He gets back, and on the end of April, he calls me up and says, I've got the big C. 6 months, and came over here about the 1st of May 2002, and we went to LSU Cancer Center together, and he wrote To America after that, and then we had this memorial service right out here on the street with Hugh Ambrose and Boise presiding and me, and it was emotional. And of course, and Tom Hanks and Spielberg flew in a couple nights before for the wake, which I thought was, you know, really, really special. Yeah. And there were a lot of questions. We had just started the beginnings of the master plan. We were into computer modeling. And Steve participated in the first planning charrette, saw the beginnings of it. And the first price he heard in April, he challenged me and the board to give him a price tag. And I said, well, we don't know yet, we're not done, I'm just starting. But give me a price tag. He pounded his hands on the table and said, 80 million. Oh God, he said, he put his head down and he pounded and pounded. We could never raise that amount of money. Anyway, passed away, but he was very optimistic at the end. And but there were a lot of questions. Could we go forward? Nick has lost his best friend and the founder of the museum, the inspiration for the museum. So it was a tough time. Tough time. And,
Yeah.
so it's, but 2 years later, we had finished the master plan. I think there might be a thing on the screen. It's the conceptual plan for the master plan was done in 2004. We went to Congress with Tom Hanks and had a thank you to 13 veterans of Congress and 700 people in the room up there to celebrate the beginning of a $282 million capital campaign. So that was a long way from where we were trying to scratch the D-Day Museum together.
So you're moving forward at that point. It looks pretty good. When you got
We're riding high, yeah. We were on cloud nine by '04 when Congress gave us that designation as America's National Museum for World War II. We weren't part of the Smithsonian, but the designation gave us the way to come back and ask Congress for more money. So it was a big deal, yeah.
And then the plans were suddenly derailed again in
Yeah,
2005.
yeah, Katrina. That's a chapter. I mean, I start that with a quote from Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan till you get punched in the face. And Pete Wilson was chairman at that time. Boy, I'm so glad you were. Of course, all the area code, everybody was out of the city. I mean, it was a disaster of colossal proportions. Entire country was fixated on it. And Pete had experienced as governor with the Northridge earthquake and calmed me down. So we're going to get through this. But for 2 or 3 weeks, we couldn't even find our staff. The city was underwater. The whole city was evacuated. We had no idea if anybody'd be in the city for a year or two, if ever. I think Speaker of the House said we ought to move the city somewhere else. So in that atmosphere, we had to have an executive committee meeting. I had to say goodbye to about 55% of our staff. We're down to 26. And I told the chairman at that time, David Velker, I said, we cut any more, we might as well close, because we'll never reopen. And then we had to fly for an executive committee meeting to Dallas to the Hyatt Hotel at the airport hotel. And everybody was there, and I had to present 4 or 5 scenarios and named them different things. The grand vision was to do everything we'd planned, all $282 million. The lowest version or option was to just stay with the D-Day Museum and forget the whole expansion, sell all the land. That was stay the course. The middle one was, halt at the Elba. So we'd eliminate a couple of buildings and stop at Poifair Street, which is now where the American sector is. And so anyway, and we had to balance a budget, and the only way to balance a budget, fortunately, we had put about $3 million into what we called the rainy day fund. It was an emergency reserve fund, and we'd never touched it before, and I don't think we've used it since. But so the big thing, first of all, we agreed we were going to halt at the Elba. We were going to not go back to D-Day. And the second thing was we had to approve the budget. And so I had to use $750,000 out of that reserve fund to balance the budget. Steve Watson had been developing our membership. The only revenue we had coming in was our national membership, which had grown to 120,000 by that time. And they were sending in some money that was starting to break even. And so I said, we got to use this rainy day fund. And I say, I'll never tell you who it was. But anyway, somebody said, well, if we use the rainy day fund now, what are we going to do if we have an emergency in the future? Well, I said, well, if this isn't the time. And it kind of broke the tension, and they approved it. We actually earned enough money from the direct marketing and the memberships to not have to use the rainy day fund, but we had to budget. Anyway,
Yeah.
we got going.
Yeah, how did you pull it off at that point? What were the key steps? You had that meeting in August 2009 with Senator Inouye?
Yeah, well, that going forward, first of all, we moved forward and we got the first building across the street, the Solomon Victory Theater. You know, that was halted the Elba part, you know. We wouldn't do the rest of the stage door canteen and the American sector. That was going to be postponed, but we managed to do all that and open in November of 2009, and we had another great grand opening. So the city was coming back in the 2 years before that, and Tom Hanks had agreed to help me with the Beyond All Boundaries film in a weak moment. We talked about the various ways that we might do a larger-than-life show on telling the whole story of World War II in 50 minutes. And there are designers, the film designers said, well, you can't ever do anything more than 20 minutes. I said, no, we have to do at least 40, 50 minutes. Otherwise, it's going to trivialize the whole story if you try to compress that into. So anyway, that went on for 3 years, but it worked spectacularly. When we opened in 2009, that show was a game changer. I mean, our visitation, I have a famous graph that had just gone down like this and then started creeping up after 2007, 8, and when we opened that building, it just went off the charts. Everybody was saying, go to the city in New Orleans and you got to see the movie. They didn't say go to the museum. They said you got to see the movie. Where's the movie? The movie is in, it's in this museum, the World War II museum. So it was phenomenal, and Tom Hanks came for that again, and he was with us all the way, and I think partly because of his deep friendship that he had for Stephen Ambrose.
And then that meeting that you were able to set up with Senator Inouye.
Yeah, that came next for the U.S. Freedom Pavilion, and we had, that was 2009, 2010, right after we opened this pavilion, we went up, and Governor Wilson, remember that, we had cultivated Danny Inouye, who is now the sidekick on the Democratic side for Senator Stevens, and Stevens was out of the Senate, and so we planned for this meeting, and it was the day before they had markup on the subcommittee for defense appropriations. So Governor was there, David Velker was there, I was there, Dick Egley, Mary Landrieu and her staff, and this was it. We had asked $25 million. You usually don't do those big earmarks like that. And Steve and I, Pete and I kind of rehearsed. I said, there's going to come a point, Pete, where Danny Inouye is going to say he can't do that much. And the plan was, at that point, Pete Wilson, former senator, colleague of Danny Inouye, would get up from the table and go walk around to Danny, and he said, and Pete, if I'm misquoting you, he said, Danny, he says, you're a veteran, I'm a veteran. You're a Medal of Honor recipient. You've lost your arm fighting for this country. If not now, when? And if not you, who is going to do this? And Danny rolled his eyes. And he said, okay, Senator Landrieu, I'll put in $5 million. What can you do? Mary Landrieu said, I don't even know how much I've got left, but I'll throw all of it in. And then the other challenge was to get Senator Vitter on the other side. And Pete and I worked until, we had till midnight to get him, because they didn't want a Republican trying to torpedo this big earmark. $25 million would build that U.S. Freedom Pavilion, and then the Boeing company came in with another 15, and then Stephen got all the planes, and and including the B-17, my gal Sal. And I think I write in the book, when we were all watching all those planes go up, and they were hoisted all up over Christmas before the opening in January 13, and when that B-17 got up, you know, here we had, it's $1 million or something that we had to pay for it. We thought we were going to pay $2 or $3 million to get one, but it's another story. You have to read the book. But here's $1 million, and all this effort, we promised Boeing this plane was going to be in there. We had to raise the building by 15 feet. And so these guys are working these hydraulics. They got guys rappelling down from the ceiling. So this 30,000-pound plane is coming up, and it gets up 4 feet off the floor and stops. And the wings go boom, boom. Oh my God, the whole thing's going to hit the ground right here on the concrete floor. But the wings started to settle down, and then the rest of it was okay. It was a great moment. But it was a scary moment.
So now you've got the buildings, you got the planes, but you have to figure out how you're going to tell the story. So how does that come about?
Well, that was hard to write, but from the beginning, the story, not just for me, but everybody going back to Steve's vision, was grounded in personal stories and putting visitors into the environments. But the personal stories were grounded and try to get people to understand the face of war. And Don Mueller was a great help to me as advisor on the first exhibit, the Road to Berlin. And all of these were the road to war, the road to Berlin, the road to Tokyo. The metaphor was the journey of the American experience through the war. And it's more about, it's the home front. It's not just the combat and the Battle of the Bulge or Normandy or D-Day. And it's the guys in the trenches, the guys that Ernie Powell wrote about. And so there was one piece in my book that I might just mention that Steinbeck was writing for the New York Herald Tribune at the time. And he just a couple sentences here. He was covering the war as a war correspondent. And he passed along the pain and the fear of death through his own writing. And he described seeing a small Italian girl in the street with her stomach blown out, and an American soldier standing over a twitching body, crying, smelling the sharp cordite in the air and the hot reek of blood. So, in telling the story of the road to Tokyo, the Pacific War, or the road to Berlin, from Catherine Pass through Sicily and Italy and Normandy and the Bulge, we had to be sure that people understood what those guys witnessed and how they wrote about it in their own words, or the words of the correspondents like Hemingway and Gellhorn and Steinbeck. And that was several pieces in there that I hope come through, because you know what these guys did and what you all did in World War II is the story we're telling here. And we had to make sure that those authentic voices came through in all of our exhibits, and that the American spirit surfaces through those stories and those exhibits and the environments and the media that we use. It all surrounds you, and I think that's been the secret of the success of the exhibits, to the extent that we have success, and I think we do.
Making the visitor feel and hear what the...
You got to feel it, you got to hear it, you got to see it in their words, as well as the words of correspondents and others. So I think that's one of the reasons that this is a great museum. And Stephen Watson honors those stories and taking it forward. And I think all of our collection people, the Institute people that are working now and doing the genealogical studies to try to find DNA from those missing in action and doing stories. So this is all about the story, Joe.
So there was something else you learned from Katrina, that you had sort of a belated recognition that you were missing something that you wanted in order to tell the mission.
Well, and Stephen knows this too, was part of that. There was sort of a epiphany. I mean, I had been vice chancellor in charge of distance learning at extension, international programs, and so forth at the University of New Orleans, but we hadn't done anything in our master plan except we had this study center for the study of the American spirit, and I had a little idea of some distance learning program in there, but it was really minuscule, conference centers. And after Katrina, so how do you extend your mission if nobody's in the city and nobody's going to come to the city for 2 years? And so Stephen and I began to think about distance learning and all ways that we could use the internet to export the story and export the exhibits, the content of the exhibits and the research that had to be done. And that led to creating the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, the Media Center, and to create a media studio and electronic classrooms. And so that everything like what's happening tonight is all being recorded and can be streamed out all over the country and all over the world, actually. And I don't know, here we had something like 10 million viewers, is that something like that? More? 30 million now have reached. So took Hurricane Katrina to, why didn't I think of that? And but we kind of reverse engineered some buildings and made a few buildings. We made the Hall of Democracy, gave it a new name and made it bigger, and built the hotel and the conference center there too. So it's all these ways, and Stephen is utilizing all that in his strategic plan, future forward, and it's Mike, everybody, collections, Pete Crane, they're all pushing our content everywhere in the world, and it's just extraordinary.
So in the book, Nick, you talk about how you still had a big task in front of you, the one that you, in fact, told people was going to be the toughest one, and maybe the one that you would be most judged by, all of you, and that was the Liberation Pavilion. What were you trying to tell?
Well, it changed over 20 years. Well, it changed over 10 years. I mean, when we did the first master plan, the last pavilion, it's called Land, Sea, and Air, and it was really going to, then Liberation Pavilion was in response to, we thought we were done in our planning, and the Barry Lord from Lord Cultural Resources said in our planning charrette, he said, well, so what? So what did the war make? Well, who cares 100 years from now? You built this museum for World War II. What does it mean? And I said, oh, I thought we were done. We didn't have to do another pavilion. So the initial plan was, because we were exhausted, it was the last pavilion in our master planning. And so we said, look, we're going to do all the great things that came out of the war, technology and medicine and the Marshall Plan and educational renaissance and the GI Bill, and all of that was going to come out of this, and it was very American-centric, civil rights, social rights, women's rights. But about 2009 or so, and Pete and other board members who were here will remember that, started saying, I think we got to rethink this, because, and everybody said, why do we got to rethink it? I said, because it's wrong. You know, America emerges from World War II as a superpower. We fought this war in all theaters of the war, and what came out of it too were the United Nations, and freedom and democracy were the countries we had just defeated, and we had an occupation in Japan and Germany and trying to help them build democracies. And the Cold War was starting, and we were, that was sort of an extension of World War II. And we created NATO, we created a global system with America as the leader, and Republicans and Democratic presidents alike, I said, fundamentally began to advance those values that we fought for in defeating fascism and totalitarianism in World War II. So that's the history. We had the best historians working with me, and then ultimately with Mike and the Institute people as we began under Stephen's leadership in the last few years to finally pull that out. And a flashback to Anne Frank's story in the Holocaust when Americans liberated those camps, so that the American story is involved in Europe and in opening the camps of the Holocaust and confronting that. So it's a flashback part of that, and the Monuments Men story. But the first floor is really about finding hope in a world destroyed. So we don't go right to celebrations on Times Square. We try to talk about the cost of victory and the Holocaust. But then you start to get into the good stories and the hope from Monuments Men's story. And when you get upstairs and you begin to see how America begins to establish a new world order, and the Nuremberg trials, and Great Responsibilities Theater, and the social change and technology. But America, it was total, we just flipped the whole script on the Liberation Pavilion and turned it from being just American-centric to a global responsibility that America exercised, not always correctly, but always trying to pursue those ideals enunciated by Franklin Roosevelt as president 9 months before Pearl Harbor, when he enunciated the four freedoms as values of what the Americans believed: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And those have been powerful. And so the theme, and the board was involved in deciding that theme, and it was freedom is the great legacy that we try to preserve, and it filters through everything in our exhibits, not just Liberation Pavilion.
Last question from me. I went through Liberation this morning, pretty remarkable. And one of the things that struck me was, you know, seeing the, as you discussed, the American role in the global order, the creation of the NATO alliance, the America staying engaged with the world. You see, when you talk about freedom of want, the image is of aid from USAID, you know, foreign assistance, and the importance that plays. Do you have any fear in what we're seeing today that we're forgetting some of the lessons of World War II?
Well, democracies are fragile. We have documented these last 80 years. Now look, we were in a similar situation in the late 30s, and you're isolationist and deep depression, and nobody wanted to be involved in foreign wars. And Woodrow Wilson had said, 1917, going into World War I, that taking America, we're going to make the world safe for democracy. Well, he failed. 20 years later, we were fighting war on two fronts. So I think we've done a better job over the last 80 years with the settlement that you just described. And how we go forward, yes, there are always threats to democracy and freedom, and those four freedoms have to be vigilant about that. But this is a history museum, and it's not an advocacy museum. We're saying that America deserves a lot of recognition for not only the conduct of the war, but the settlement that came out of it, and our role in the last 80 years in preventing another World War III. It's up to future generations that come here, and all of you who are here. I mean, we've been carrying the torch. Stephen has got the torch, and you all are carrying it, and the younger generations, my grandkids, are going to be having to deal with the realities of the politics of that are in the current day and going forward. So we have a point of view. I'm biased toward what we believed was the way that we prevailed in the last 80 years. And Steve Ambrose had a fundamental faith in the American spirit and the American people to ultimately do the right thing. And I believe there is a moral patina to World War II. There is a redemptive quality to, I think, how we came out of that war and what we've tried to achieve in the last 80 years. So America always has to find its own moral center, and it's not always in the best shape, but Steve believed, and I do too, that you've got to have faith in the people that got to defend democracy and freedom and all that entails. So we're not journalists, though. That's your job. You were a journalist, so you got to have opinions about the future and write about them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Vogel and Dr. Nick Mueller, preserving the legacy, creating the National World War II Museum. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you, Nick and Steve. You know, I knew a lot about the history of the museum before tonight, but your talk certainly shed incredible light on much more, and more importantly, inspiration to us all. Steve, thanks for leading the conversation. Thanks for all your work on this important public history. Nick, thanks to you, to Steve, to the whole team, the press, the folks behind the scenes that brought this fascinating institutional history and the personal memoir to the broader public. Now, before you go, get your copies at the retail station that's behind you. Nick will be available to sign copies over there by the Higgins boat. And I want to remind you of a few important events. You know, during the book signing, please enjoy the continued reception. You know, please get your books and have them signed. Now, tonight, over in Founders Plaza across the street, we'll pay tribute with a luminaria to the over 2,500 Americans who lost their lives on D-Day. And so an opportunity to do that. Afterwards, we've extended happy hour at Kilroy's until Kilroy's closes this evening in honor of our speakers tonight. And of course, tomorrow's a full day of programming. We'll continue mission starting at 6:30 a.m. for the H-Hour Remembrance Gathering. At 8:30, we'll gather to welcome the heroes. You know, more than 24 World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors that'll be with us, in addition to our comrades here this evening. At 1100, Dr. Hal Baumgarten D-Day commemoration in the U.S. Freedom Pavilion. And of course, an amazing opportunity to visit the museum. So again, join me in a round of applause for Steve and Nick.
Let's go Q&A.
Thank you for coming. Godspeed and God bless America.